Welcome back to the deep dive. You know how much we love a good deep dive here. And today we're going down a particular rabbit hole. It's about those books, the ones folks tend to whisper about. You know what I mean?
Yes, the feared, forbidden, or just plain weird.
Exactly. The ones that sometimes end up in a special collection or tucked away in some occult archives, right?
Right. And for today's deep dive, we're diving into some alternative interpretations of pretty well-known stories, specifically early Christianity, and, well, to be frank, it presents some surprising takes.
It really does. We're going beyond the usual Sunday school stuff. We're talking about early Christianity seen through the lens of, let's call it mystic wisdom. The sources you've given me for this deep dive, they really emphasize this hidden, almost secret stream of knowledge underneath the more familiar stories, don't they?
That's a great way to put it, yeah. It definitely challenges some of the, let's call them the standard interpretations of key figures and events.
Totally. So we're not here to debate theology, right? We're
No.
here to understand this specific lens, this specific perspective that our sources offer. We're exploring the ideas, the arguments, the occult archives, you could say, within the New Testament itself.
Precisely. And what better place to start than with the very beginning, John the Baptist.
Ah, yes, the voice crying out in the wilderness, that classic image of repentance, of change. It's a powerful one, isn't it?
Extremely powerful. And our source material really digs into how this message was sort of tapping into older prophetic traditions.
Yeah.
It really sets the stage for this anticipation of something momentous about to happen. But it's not long before we encounter those intriguing figures who show up to acknowledge the infant Jesus.
Right, the wise men from the East. But wait, our source is making a point of saying that term might not be totally accurate. They weren't just generically wise, right?
That's the point being made, yeah. The original Greek term used in Matthew's Gospel, it's magi. And that distinction isn't trivial, really. Biblical scholars and encyclopedias, they largely agree on this. The term wise men, that seems to have come from later English translations, may be obscuring a more precise identity for these folks.
Okay, so who exactly were these magi, and why is it so crucial that we understand them by that specific title?
Well, the term magi, it had some serious weight back then, especially in ancient Persia. They were often priests, highly learned individuals, advisors. Think of them as keepers of wisdom, particularly within the Zoroastrian tradition.
Ah, Zoroastrianism. And didn't they have some beliefs that kind of foreshadowed later Christian ideas?
That's what our source is pointing out, yeah. The Magi, they held beliefs in resurrection, in a future life, and even the coming of a savior figure. These ideas that, as you said, definitely find echoes in Christian theology.
Okay, so they're not just random well-wishers showing up with gifts,
Right.
but there's also that darker side to the term magi, you know, the connection with black magic and sorcery. How do we square that?
It's true, the term did get a bit tarnished over time, unfortunately. But the source really stresses that Matthew, when he used the term magi, he meant it in that original, more respectful sense. And here's where it gets interesting, I think. They go into the etymology, the root of the word, connecting magi to magic and magician. But the definition of magic here, it's not about tricks or illusions. It's presented as hidden wisdom, the mastery of secret forces in nature.
Hidden wisdom. So these weren't just travelers who happened to see a bright star, were they?
That's not how this perspective sees it, no. The source is arguing that these magi, they were like representatives from major mystic brotherhoods and occult orders, adepts, masters, hierophants, the real deal. And they were there at the very beginning of Jesus' life, intensely interested in this. Master of masters, a figure who's coming, well, they had long anticipated.
Instead of a purely divine revelation to everyday people, we've got these highly initiated mystics, right?
Yeah.
And they're among the first to recognize his divine nature.
Right. The source even talks about the pleasure and just pride that occultists and mystics take in this idea, this recognition coming from their own tradition. It acknowledges the potential friction with more traditional Christian views, but it emphasizes this early, intimate connection between, let's say, the masters, the magi, and the master Jesus.
And what about the Star of Bethlehem? That's got to be just pure miracle, right?
Well, our source challenges what it calls the vulgar traditions about the star. Forget about some magical orb hanging over a house for a year.
Yeah.
They propose a more natural scientific occurrence, still divinely significant, absolutely, but understood, interpreted by these guys, the mystics and astrologers.
Astrologers. Now, that's something most folks don't associate with the Christmas story. How common was astrology back then, in Jewish and surrounding cultures? Does our source say anything about whether it was accepted or rejected in early Christianity?
That's a great question. And yeah, astrology was a big deal in the ancient world. It was present in different forms across many cultures, including to some degree within Judaism, although with varying levels of acceptance. Our source emphasizes the Magi's skill in astrology, presenting it as a key element in their journey and recognition. And they even cite early church fathers who recognized the connection between astrology and the Magi, suggesting it wasn't totally dismissed in early Christian thought, at least not in some circles.
So the star, in this view, it was an actual astronomical event, seen and interpreted through their astrological knowledge and, of course, their esoteric understanding.
Exactly. And it wasn't just one group who was anticipating this event. The source stresses that the coming of the master, it was a major focus in Eastern mystic and occult organizations. We're talking India, Persia, Chaldea, Egypt, all over the place. They were anticipating this great avatar, this divine appearance in human form, a being who would liberate the world from what they called materiality.
So it's like they had their own versions of the Jewish messianic prophecies, but
Yeah.
different, right?
Right. And while the Jewish tradition focused on a Messiah from David's line in Bethlehem, often envisioned as an earthly king, these Eastern mystics, well, they viewed their own predictions as, let's say, of superior moment. They were expecting an avatar of deity, the ultimate grand master, the top dog of the universal grand lodge of mystic, you could say.
Wow, that's a huge difference in understanding what this coming was all about.
It is. And this explains why those magi were so devoted, why their journey took so long. They weren't looking for a newborn in a manger. They were looking for an older child, which lines up with their, year-long trek following those celestial signs.
Right. This really changes the picture compared to those classic nativity scenes, doesn't it? You know, the ones with shepherds and magi all clustered around the manger.
The source really draws a line between those two accounts. The shepherds, according to Luke, they had a direct encounter with an angel announcing the birth in a manger. Very straightforward. The classic signs, the swaddling clothes. A more immediate, maybe more accessible revelation. The Magi, they show up later at a house, guided by their esoteric knowledge.
And, of course, the famous gifts, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, traditional presents, or is there a deeper meaning here in this mystical context?
Well, our source connects these gifts to specific symbolic meanings that would have resonated with mystic understanding. Gold representing royalty and also the spirit. Frankincense, signifying divinity. And myrrh, well, with its preservative qualities, it symbolizes mortal life. So not just random presence, but symbolic, prophetic even.
So they perform their rites, they give their symbolic gifts, and then they just leave.
Well, they depart Bethlehem, but the source emphasizes that they didn't forget about the child. They kept a watchful eye on him, which hints at them knowing something about Jesus's, what they call his missing years, those years the Gospels are kind of quiet on. Those years that, according to those Eastern traditions, held some really important events.
Okay, wow. That's a really fascinating setup. Now, let's tackle another cornerstone of the traditional narrative, the virgin birth. We've got two gospel accounts, Matthew and Luke. What alternative perspectives does our source material offer on this?
This is where the source really starts to critique that traditional interpretation. And it begins by highlighting what seems to be a tension within Matthew itself. On one hand, the gospel says Joseph was just the reputed father. But then right in the first chapter, there's that genealogy, tracing Jesus' line back to David through Joseph, seemingly to fulfill that messianic prophecy, right? Critics have pointed out that this suggests the original Matthew, well, he might have viewed Jesus as the Hebrew Messiah, that earthly king fulfilling the lineage, rather than a divine avatar born of a virgin.
That's a pretty big challenge to the standard reading. It implies that the virgin birth story, well, it might not have been central to how people first understood Jesus.
Exactly. And the source then goes on to present perspectives from within the church itself, suggesting that the idea of a virgin birth, it might have originated more easily outside of Judaism. The Jewish doctrine, it emphasizes the oneness of God, the importance of marriage. These ideas, well, they would have made a virgin birth concept a bit harder to swallow within that tradition, wouldn't they?
It does make you wonder. So are they saying the virgin birth story is more of a later addition, maybe influenced by what was happening in the broader culture at the time?
That's definitely a key argument being presented, yeah. The source even quotes Reverend R.J. Campbell, who states flat out, no New Testament passage directly or indirectly prophesies a virgin birth for Jesus.
Really? Not one. So what about Luke's account? That's the other main source for the virgin birth story.
Now, with Luke, the source points out that scholars generally agree it was written later than the other Gospels, and that the author probably wasn't an eyewitness. probably a Gentile, maybe Greek, and a pretty skilled writer. Tradition says it was Luke, Paul's companion, writing after Paul died. But what's interesting is that Luke, a follower of Paul, included the virgin birth story, even though Paul himself never mentions it.
Wait, so Paul, who wrote all those letters about Jesus, never mentions the virgin birth. That does seem like a pretty significant omission if it was such a core belief.
That's exactly the point. The source even suggests that maybe the story was added to Luke's gospel later, what they call interpolation.
So this absence of the virgin birth in other key writings, that's a big part of this alternative perspective then.
Absolutely. The source goes on to list several more arguments against the virgin birth being a foundational doctrine. Other gospel and letter writers, they focus on Joseph's family line. Paul and the other apostles, they emphasize the death, resurrection, and ascension, but no virgin birth. It doesn't appear in early church traditions or in the preaching we see in the book of Acts. And then there's the possibility that the legend, well, it might have come from those pagan myths about miraculous births that were floating around.
It's a very different way of looking at it.
It is. And Reverend Dr. Campbell, he's quoted again, saying that believing in the virgin birth actually puts a barrier between Jesus and humanity. It makes him less relatable, less human. He suggests that Jesus was just the child of Joseph and Mary with a normal childhood.
That's definitely a more down-to-earth view, isn't it?
Right. And a German theologian, Soltau, he even goes so far as to condemn making belief in the virgin birth a requirement for being a true Christian.
Okay, so that's the historical and biblical side of the argument. Now, how does the occult perspective, which is really what our source focuses on, how does it view this virgin birth legend?
The occult perspective, as it's presented here, puts the spirit front and center. The spirit is the real essence. The physical body is just a temporary shell. So this idea of the absolute, of God overshadowing a woman to create a physical conception, well, they see that as crude, barbarous, unnecessary, and they even say it defies natural laws.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. And the reasoning is this. They believe every conception, every birth, it's the work of the divine will, but working through natural law. Those seeming miracles, they're really just the manifestation of natural laws we haven't fully grasped yet. So they reject this idea of conception happening outside of the normal biological processes.
So they're not denying divine involvement in birth, but they see it as operating within the natural order, not breaking it.
That's it exactly. And this then leads into a discussion about the resurrection of the body versus the immortality of the soul. Now, the source points out that the resurrection of the body, that was something kind of unique to early Christianity. The idea of the soul being immortal, well, that was widespread in lots of other traditions.
It's fascinating that some early Christian writers, they were actually materialists, believing the soul itself was physical. That's not what we usually think of.
Yeah, the source mentions that. And it explains that the early church's emphasis on the body rising again, well, that was partly to counter those Gnostic ideas which often downplayed the body's importance. But over time, this focus on the immortality of the soul, it gained more and more importance within Christian thought, even though people still recite the belief in bodily resurrection in those creeds.
So they're saying that even though it's still part of the official doctrine, the focus has really shifted. Okay, but if not a physical virgin birth, how does the occult understanding explain, well, Jesus' divine parentage?
The source completely rejects this idea that normal human fatherhood and motherhood are somehow impure. They view that divine trinity, father, mother, and child, as totally pure and sacred. They even use that story of the journey to Egypt as a symbol of the holiness of parenthood. The occult secret doctrine of the real virgin birth, according to this text, it's that the spirit of Jesus, it was a virgin spirit. It came directly from the absolute and hadn't gone through those cycles of reincarnation that other souls do. This pure spirit then incarnated, took on a physical body. It's like a pure spark of the divine, untouched by any previous experiences, entering the world for the first time.
So it's a virgin birth of the spirit, not of the body.
You got it. And the source goes on to say that Jesus, he gradually awakened to his true nature as God incarnate. And his life, it becomes the symbol of the journey of the whole human race, where each of us goes through our own Garden of Gethsemane, our own crucifixion, and ascension.
Yeah.
They call this a higher conception of the virgin birth than that. Literal physical interpretation.
It's a much more metaphorical and universal interpretation, isn't it? Okay, let's move on. Our source then presents Jesus not just as a Jewish figure, but as a world prophet. What's the basis for that view?
This perspective.
Yeah.
It challenges that idea of Jesus being solely a Jewish holy man or the Hebrew Messiah, just destined for David's throne. Instead, they see him as a world prophet with a message for everyone. God as Father, humanity as one family. The source even cites traditions of Isa in Persia, just of Yosas among the Hindus, and similar figures in China as potential signs of his influence, his travels beyond the world of the New Testament.
So are they saying that Jesus's ministry and impact went further than the usual historical and geographical boundaries?
That's the implication, yeah.
Yeah.
They portray him as this figure who planted those seeds of human freedom, challenging those rigid religious authorities, not just in his own backyard, but maybe on a much larger scale. And they mentioned this occult belief that after traveling in India, Persia, and Egypt, Jesus actually spent a good amount of time with the Essenes.
Ah, the Essenes, that mystic organization we've talked about before. What role do they play in Jesus's life according to this perspective?
Well, the source suggests that Jesus' time with the Essenes, it was pivotal. It was during this time, this period of reflection and study, that he really started paying attention to the work of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
He saw John's message as a way to open things up, to prepare people for his own mission, to guide the Jewish people towards his own understanding of truth and life, you could say.
So they're looking at John the Baptist himself through this Essenic lens, right?
100%. They present John as the forerunner, diligently following those Essenic principles, preaching repentance, righteousness, practicing baptism, and most importantly, announcing that the master was coming. And they really emphasized John's humility. He was clear that he wasn't the master, just the one preparing the way.
And after his baptism by John, Jesus goes into the wilderness. We usually understand this as the temptation by Satan. How is that different in the occult understanding?
Well, in the occult understanding, the source presents this time in the wilderness not as just some random event, but as this super intense occult test. It's like a trial by fire designed to build up his inner power, his spiritual strength, his endurance. It's presented as the basis for that ordeal of the wilderness degree that you find in some occult orders.
So it wasn't just about resisting those external temptations then. It was more like an inner struggle, a spiritual battle.
Oh, you got it. The source describes his journey alone through this desolate landscape. They mention En-Gedi, this village in the wilderness, and this forbidding mountain, Quarantana, all these places with, occult significance. And they emphasize that he's totally isolated, completely focused on that riddle of the voice. This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. And he's climbing this barren mountain, no food, no shelter, no company. The answer, it has to come from within.
So this aloneness, this spiritual hunger, they're presenting it as something every seeker has to go through to really awaken, aren't they?
Absolutely. And the source goes on to explain that the real struggle here, it was Jesus grappling with those deep-seated Jewish expectations. That whole idea of the Messiah being this warrior king who would liberate Israel from Roman rule. The source mentions that some occult traditions suggest that Jesus didn't really consider himself the Messiah until he returned to his own land, after all that traveling and studying. Maybe it was those Essenic teachings pointing to those miraculous events surrounding his birth that influenced him.
So Jesus himself, he was wrestling with who he was, with the real nature of his mission.
That's it. The question he was facing was, what am I? And that retreat into the wilderness, that was his way to find the answer. The temptations, they become these specific spiritual battles, resisting the urge to use his power to meet his own needs, like turning stones into bread, resisting the lure of worldly power and glory, becoming that conquering Messiah king, leading armies, using occult powers to dominate, establishing Israel as this top nation. Then there's the temptation of religious power, making Judaism the world religion with himself as the ultimate mouthpiece,
It's those classic temptations, but reframed as these tests of his spiritual mastery, of his understanding.
Right. The source even suggests that during this time, there were these thought forms, these disembodied entities trying to influence him, to gain power through him. But Jesus rejects them all. He sees through them. And they call these entities fiends of darkness. And it's only after this, after going through this ordeal, that he really gets his answer. He comes down that mountain and returns to his mission knowing what lies ahead, including his suffering and death.
So it wasn't a moment of weakness, but this pivotal moment of victory that sets him on his path. Okay, so let's move on to his early ministry, to those demonstrations of power that we often call miracles.
So he returns to his home region after his travels. And one of the first major events is that wedding feast at Cana. And the source points out that people there, they had all these different ideas about Jesus. Some thought he was a traveling teacher. Others whispered about him being the Messiah. It was a mixed bag, really.
And the turning water into wine, that gets explained through that occult lens, right?
Exactly. They describe it not as some supernatural breaking of natural laws, but as a, and I quote, comparatively simple occult feat that he'd learned during his time in India. They even describe the method. He focuses intently on those water jars, passes his hand over them, creates a clear mental image of wine, and then, using his will, he makes it happen. And the reactions are all over the place, too. Some guests are excited, some priests are displeased, and then you've got the authorities, skeptical as always.
So they're demystifying it a bit, but still presenting it as something extraordinary, as a sign of his advanced abilities. Now, what about that year of obscurity that theologians talk about? You know, that time in Jesus' early ministry, that's not very well documented.
Yeah. Our source, they reframe that year of obscurity as this crucial period for laying the groundwork for his work, even though the Gospels don't give us a ton of details about that time. And this period, it's followed by the purification of the temple. And the source, it really highlights Jesus' righteous anger at what's happening there, you know? All the buying and selling, the money changers, the merchants selling animals for sacrifice. He sees it as this deep corruption of a sacred place.
That image of Jesus using a whip to drive out the merchants, it's pretty powerful. Not exactly the meek and lowly Nazarene we usually picture.
Right. It shows him as this forceful reformer, taking a stand against the abuse of the temple. And after this, his ministry takes a turn. He goes back to Galilee with this new air of authority, using parables in his teaching and attracting larger, more educated crowds. And it's important to note that whenever they talk about Jesus' miracles, they always stress that these weren't supernatural events, but more like the skillful application of natural laws that most people didn't understand. Laws that had been mastered by those with advanced occult knowledge.
Can you give me an example of how they explain one of these miracles through that lens?
Sure. They talk about the healing of that nobleman's son in Capernaum, you know, the one where Jesus heals him from a distance. The nobleman begs Jesus to come to Capernaum, but Jesus simply says, "Your son is healed." And when the nobleman goes home, he finds out that his son recovered at that exact moment. They present this as an example of absent treatment, a real practice used by occultists and metaphysical healers.
So it's about directed intention, energy influencing reality across space. What about that incident in the synagogue at Nazareth, that one where things get kind of ugly?
Right. So Jesus goes back to Nazareth. He teaches in the synagogue. But the people there, they doubt his authority. They demand a miracle as proof. And then they basically reject him because of his humble background. The source says that his refusal to perform a miracle on demand, that was actually in line with occult principles. But the situation escalates. There's verbal abuse, they call him a fake, and it all culminates in them trying to push him off a cliff.
And that's where Jesus uses his power to defend himself.
That's right. The source describes him using this focused look, this gaze that fills the mob with fear, and they scatter. And after that, he leaves Nazareth for good. They present this as foreshadowing, you know, pointing towards his eventual crucifixion. And then he sets up his new base in Capernaum.
And even his own family, they had a hard time with his unconventional path, didn't they?
The source mentions how his family was worried about his behavior, how they saw him as a bit of a black sheep, except for his mother, who seemed to get him on a deeper level. They also highlight his ascetic lifestyle, living off the generosity of others. It was unusual for a rabbi at that time, and it was likely influenced by the Essenes, or those Eastern traditions he had encountered. And this is all happening as he's starting to gather his disciples around him.
Okay, let's talk about the core of his work, his teachings, and the choosing of the 12 apostles. Now, the source mentions that the Gospels don't give us a ton of detail about that first year of his ministry, but they argue that it was super important.
Right. They say that this first year, it was all about laying down the foundation. And a big part of that was Jesus challenging that traditional Hebrew view of God as this wrathful being who demands blood sacrifice for atonement, including the idea that Jesus' own blood somehow appeased God's anger. The source strongly condemns this view, calling it, and I quote, a barbarous conception. They say it stems from a lack of understanding of the real inner teachings.
So they're saying that the mystics within the Christian tradition, they never really accepted that interpretation.
Exactly. And they suggest that right now we're in this dawn of a new day where the church is starting to rediscover those deeper truths of what they call mystic Christianity. And it's after this foundational year that Jesus chooses the 12 apostles. He spends a night alone in prayer, meditating on a hill near Capernaum, and then he picks his 12.
So it wasn't just a random group of followers. There was a deliberate process of initiation and training involved.
That's how they see it. The occult tradition describes Jesus systematically teaching his disciples, leading them through different levels of mystic knowledge, sharing specific occult knowledge. And the choosing of the 12, that marked the culmination of this whole process, the transmission of those final highest teachings. And they argue that there were these two levels of teaching, the exoteric, the public teachings for the masses, and the esoteric, the secret teachings reserved for those in the inner circle, for the 12. And they back this up with scriptural passages and writings from early church fathers. The source claims that the deepest, most fundamental truths were revealed to the 12 at that moment, making them masters in this tradition. And they link this directly to the Sermon on the Mount. They say that while Jesus was speaking to those big crowds, the real meaning, the deeper understanding, it was meant for the 12, for those who had the key to unlock it through those inner teachings.
Wow. And the miracles, they continued during this period of his expanding ministry, didn't they?
They did. The raising of that widow's son at Nain,
Yeah.
it's presented as this powerful demonstration of Jesus' abilities, one that scared and awed the crowds. And of course, he got the attention of the authorities who saw him as more and more of a threat. And then there's that famous story about Jesus at the Pharisees' house with the woman and that alabaster box of perfume. The source interprets this through that mystic lens, highlighting Jesus' ability to read the Pharisees' mind, to know his judgmental thoughts. And they emphasize Jesus' gentle but firm rebuke of his host, contrasting his lack of hospitality with the woman's genuine devotion. And of course, there's that powerful moment where he forgives the woman, saying, "Much hath been forgiven her, for she hath loved greatly, and go in peace, for thy sins are forgiven thee." Which, of course, really riles up the Pharisee and his buddies who see this as blasphemy. This guy claiming the right to forgive sins, it's like adding fuel to the fire.
So even his acts of compassion, his deep understanding, it just creates more opposition. So as his ministry keeps growing, what manifestations of his power does our source highlight?
His ministry just keeps evolving. He's adapting his teaching for different audiences, always holding back those inner teachings for his close circle. And the source keeps hammering home that point, that the miracles weren't supernatural, but like him using natural laws that most folks just didn't understand. They then talk about the Gerasene demoniacs, those two guys possessed by, well, what the Bible calls devils. And the source points out how the church has often downplayed those stories about demons and devils, calling them superstitions. But occult science, they say, it explains these as entities on the astral plane, real beings, but existing on a different level of reality. And they give a strong warning against meddling with those astral plane phenomena.
That's a very different way to think about demonic possession, isn't it? Okay, so what about the raising of Jairus' daughter?
So the story goes, Jairus is desperate to save his dying daughter, but then the news comes she's dead. But when Jesus arrives, he says she's only sleeping. He takes her hand, tells her to get up, and she does. The source presents this as yet another example of Jesus' power, and of course, it creates all sorts of arguments and debate, but Jesus just moves on with his work. Then the source describes how Jesus starts sending his apostles out on these healing missions, teaching them to use the occult methods he'd taught them. And they're successful, really successful, which of course makes the authorities even more suspicious. Even Herod starts to get nervous.
And then there's the feeding of the 5,000, one of those really iconic miracle stories. How do they explain that one?
They present it as Jesus using his advanced abilities to multiply that small amount of food, those 5 loaves and 2 fish, to feed those massive crowds. They even mention the practical detail of the disciples gathering up the leftover bits, filling all those baskets. And then, of course, there's that amazing story of Jesus walking on water. They explain it as an example of the power of faith to make impossible things happen. It's a core principle in occult teachings, they say. And they use the example of Peter, how he was able to walk on water as long as his faith was strong. But as soon as fear crept in, he started to sink. And then, of course, Jesus rescues him.
It's that idea of faith as this actual force that can shape reality. It's a recurring theme in these interpretations, isn't it?
It is, definitely. But the source also points out that the way Jesus fed the multitude, it caused some problems. It might have broken certain rules within those occult brotherhoods. And then you've got those Pharisees and scribes always on his case. They start criticizing the disciples for not washing their hands before eating. And Jesus, he gets really angry. He calls them out for their hypocrisy, for valuing those man-made rules over the true laws of God. And all this opposition, it takes a toll on him. He's discouraged. So he decides to take a break, to withdraw with his followers to Tyre and Sidon. They need to rest, to regroup, and to make new plans, because he knows that this is the beginning of the end, as he puts it.